"Ma'am, you dropped this." Nobody moved when the little boy said it. The restaurant stayed painfully quiet except for silverware clinking somewhere near the kitchen and rain tapping softly against the front windows. Grace Miller bent down slowly to pick up the crumpled $5 bill her son had been trying to hand back after it slipped from her pocket beside table 14. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear anymore. From humiliation. Across the dining room, several customers kept pretending not to stare while her boss stood near the register in complete silence after yelling at her in front of everyone only seconds earlier. Grace could still hear the words replaying inside her head. If you can't handle being a mother and an employee at the same time, maybe you shouldn't be here at all. She looked toward her son sitting quietly in the booth beside the rain-covered window. 8 years old. Thin jacket. Trying very hard not to cry because children always know when adults are breaking apart even when nobody says it out loud. Grace forced herself to smile at him anyway. That was the strange thing about survival. Sometimes dignity looked almost invisible from the outside. 14 months later, people inside that same restaurant would struggle to recognize the woman who walked back through those doors. But on this cold November night, standing beneath cheap fluorescent lights with tears burning behind her eyes, Grace still believed this was the worst moment of her life. She had no idea someone else inside the restaurant was quietly watching everything happen, and would remember her face long after everyone else forgot it. Grace Miller learned very early that humiliation sounded quieter than people imagined. It was not always screaming or slammed doors or dramatic scenes from television dramas. Sometimes humiliation sounded like customers pretending not to hear while somebody destroyed your dignity 3 feet away from the coffee machine. Sometimes it sounded like your 8-year-old son whispering, "It's okay, Mom," when children should never have to comfort adults in the first place. The rain continued falling outside the restaurant long after Daniel Whitmore walked back into his office without apologizing for what happened. Inside Miller's downtown grill, conversations slowly returned in uncomfortable fragments while waitresses avoided looking directly at Grace as she picked up the tray she dropped during the confrontation. One plate had shattered beside booth 14 after Ethan accidentally ran toward her while she balanced orders during the dinner rush. That alone would not have mattered. Restaurants survived broken plates every day. But Daniel had been watching from near the register, already irritated about overtime costs and understaffed shifts. The moment the tray hit the floor, his patience disappeared publicly. "This is exactly the problem," he snapped loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Every week it's something." Grace bent down immediately trying to clean broken ceramic before Ethan stepped on anything sharp, but Daniel kept talking. "You show up late, distracted, exhausted." "I'm sorry," Grace interrupted softly while gathering pieces into shaking hands. "Ethan's school called this morning and there's always an excuse." Silence spread through nearby tables after that. Grace still remembered the way several customers suddenly became fascinated with their coffee cups instead of looking at her directly. Public shame made strangers uncomfortable because deep down everybody recognized how easily it could become them instead. Ethan stood frozen near the booth clutching his backpack straps while rainwater dripped from his sneakers onto the floor. Daniel noticed him then and sighed heavily, like the child himself represented another inconvenience. "If you can't handle being a mother and an employee at the same time," he said coldly, "maybe you shouldn't be here at all." The sentence landed harder than yelling would have. Grace stopped moving completely for half a second while broken ceramic remained in her hands. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Somewhere near the kitchen window, silverware clinked softly against plates while nobody spoke. Then Daniel walked away. Just like that. Grace finished cleaning quietly because survival rarely paused long enough for emotional collapse. 20 minutes later she was refilling coffee again like nothing happened while rain streaked down restaurant windows beneath neon beer signs flickering softly through the dark. But inside, something had cracked open silently. Around 9:30 the dinner crowd finally thinned enough for Grace to sit beside Ethan in booth 7 near the back hallway. He picked slowly at grilled cheese while pretending not to notice her swollen eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong," he whispered eventually. Grace forced a small smile. Neither did you. Ethan nodded but continued staring at the table. Children understood more than adults liked believing. Especially children raised around financial stress long enough to recognize shame before language fully explained it. Grace brushed damp hair behind her ear and looked out toward rain-covered streets glowing orange beneath traffic lights. Toledo always looked lonelier during November storms. The city carried exhaustion differently after dark. Bus stops filled with workers too tired to speak. Old apartment windows glowing softly above liquor stores and laundromats. People surviving quietly inside small spaces nobody else noticed. Grace knew that world intimately. She lived inside a one-bedroom apartment above a pawn shop 12 blocks from the restaurant where heat barely worked after midnight and pipes rattled through walls all winter long. Since the divorce 2 years earlier, life became a constant negotiation between bills. Rent or groceries. Ethan's asthma medication or repairing brakes on the car. Sleep or second shifts. Some nights she sat awake after Ethan fell asleep calculating numbers repeatedly like changing the order might somehow create more money. But despite everything, Grace rarely complained aloud. Exhaustion became private once survival turned permanent. Around closing time, an older dishwasher named Luis approached quietly while Grace counted tips beside the register. He slid a folded $20 bill toward her without making eye contact. Customer left extra, he muttered softly. Grace immediately shook her head. Luis, I can't take it. His voice stayed gentle but firm. Boy needs winter gloves. Grace looked down at the money while emotion tightened unexpectedly inside her throat. Small kindnesses always hurt more when people received them too late in the day. Thank you, she whispered. Luis nodded once before returning toward the kitchen. Grace watched him disappear behind swinging doors while Ethan slept curled beside two pushed-together booths under her coat. She wondered briefly how many invisible kindnesses held struggling people together without anybody noticing. Near the front windows, a man in a dark charcoal coat remained seated alone long after finishing his coffee. Grace recognized him vaguely from previous nights. Mid-40s maybe. Expensive watch. Quiet demeanor. Usually sat near the rain-covered windows reading documents while ordering black coffee without sugar. Tonight he had witnessed everything. Grace knew because several times during the humiliation she accidentally caught him watching from across the dining room with an expression difficult to understand. Not pity exactly. Something quieter. More uncomfortable. He stood eventually and approached the register while Grace gathered receipts. Your son dropped this earlier, he said calmly, placing a small folded paper onto the counter. Grace frowned slightly before opening it. Inside sat a crisp $100 bill. She looked up immediately. Sir, I can't. Yes, you can. His voice remained controlled, almost detached, but his eyes softened briefly toward Ethan sleeping in the booth. Buy him gloves. Grace stared at the money silently. Pride and desperation collided painfully inside her chest. I appreciate it, she said carefully, but I'm not asking for charity. The man nodded slightly like he respected the answer. I know. Then after a pause he added quietly, that's probably why you need it most. Grace did not know what to say after that. He left before she could decide whether accepting the money would feel humiliating or necessary. Through the rain-covered window she watched him cross the street toward a black sedan waiting beneath traffic lights. The driver opened the back door immediately. Expensive car. Expensive coat. Someone important probably. Yet he looked strangely lonely standing there beneath cold rain before disappearing inside the vehicle. Grace folded the $100 bill carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket without telling Ethan. That night after work she carried her sleeping son upstairs through the apartment building while fluorescent hallway lights buzzed overhead. Apartment 4B smelled faintly like old carpet and radiator heat. Inside, the space looked exactly like exhaustion felt. Piles of folded laundry waiting near the couch. School permission slips beside overdue electric bills. Cheap soup cans stacked above the sink. Grace laid Ethan carefully beneath blankets before standing quietly beside the window overlooking wet city streets below. Her reflection looked older lately. 34 years old but carrying fatigue that belonged to someone much further along in life. She remembered Daniel's words replaying again inside her head. Maybe you shouldn't be here at all. Grace closed her eyes briefly. The painful part was not the humiliation itself. It was how quickly she believed it. Around 2 in the morning she sat alone at the kitchen table balancing unpaid bills beneath weak yellow light while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. The $100 bill remained folded beside her coffee mug untouched. Grace stared at it for a long time. Then finally she reached for Ethan's school backpack instead. One zipper hung broken where fabric had started tearing apart near the straps. She pulled out his homework carefully and found a crumpled worksheet tucked inside. Write about someone you admire. Ethan's handwriting covered the page in uneven pencil marks. My mom works all the time even when she's tired. She cries in the bathroom sometimes but still makes pancakes on Saturdays. She says we're gonna be okay even when I think she doesn't believe it herself. Grace lowered the paper slowly after reading. The apartment became completely silent except for distant traffic moving through rain outside. Then quietly, without anyone there to witness it, Grace finally allowed herself to cry. The next morning, Grace woke before sunrise because survival rarely waited for emotional recovery. The apartment remained cold despite the radiator rattling constantly through the walls, and somewhere downstairs the pawn shop owner dragged metal security gates open with harsh scraping sounds that echoed through the building every morning at 6. Ethan still slept curled beneath blankets on the pull-out couch while weak gray light slowly filled the apartment window overlooking wet Toledo streets below. Grace stood quietly in the kitchen wearing mismatched socks and yesterday's sweatshirt, staring at the $100 bill still folded beside unpaid utility notices. She had not touched it all night. Something about accepting help from strangers always felt dangerous after enough years surviving alone. Help usually arrived carrying conditions eventually. Expectations. Judgments. Debt that was not always financial. But Ethan needed winter boots. The ones he wore now had small cracks near the soles where cold rain seeped through during school mornings. Grace rubbed tired fingers across her eyes before finally folding the money carefully into an envelope marked groceries beneath the kitchen drawer. Survival won again over pride. Around 7:30 Ethan shuffled sleepily into the kitchen rubbing his eyes while dragging his backpack behind him. You working today? He asked quietly. Grace nodded while pouring cereal into chipped bowls. Double shift. Ethan looked disappointed but not surprised. Children adjusted to absence faster than adults realized. Mrs. Patterson said I can stay after school again, he mumbled. Grace hated hearing that sentence every time because it reminded her how often other people raised her son while she carried coffee trays for strangers downtown. I'll try getting home earlier tonight, she promised softly even though both of them understood promises worked differently once money became involved. Ethan nodded politely anyway. They ate breakfast beside the apartment window watching buses move slowly through morning rain while local news anchors discussed highway traffic and winter weather warnings nobody inside working-class apartments had the luxury to avoid. Grace studied Ethan carefully while he tied worn sneakers near the front door. 8 years. Old already. Thin shoulders. Quiet personality. Too observant for a child his age. Sometimes she caught him watching her the same way adults watched people standing too close to emotional collapse. That frightened her more than overdue bills ever could. After dropping Ethan at school, Grace drove downtown beneath heavy gray skies in a car that shuddered every time she stopped at red lights. The check engine light had stayed on for 3 months now, but repairs belonged to the category of problems poor people postponed until consequences arrived physically. Miller's downtown grill sat between a pharmacy and an insurance office near the business district where executives grabbed lunch during weekdays before returning to warm offices and predictable salaries. Grace parked behind the restaurant near overflowing dumpsters and sat motionless inside the car for a full minute before forcing herself back into yesterday's humiliation. That was another thing survival taught people eventually. Emotional pain still required clocking in afterward. Inside, the restaurant smelled like burnt coffee and bleach while morning staff prepared for breakfast rush. Louise nodded quietly when she entered but said nothing about last night. Grace appreciated that. Darlene, another waitress around 50 with smoker's voice and tired mascara, approached carefully near the lockers. "You okay?" she asked softly. Grace tied her apron without looking up. "Not really." Darlene sighed knowingly. "Daniel's been in a mood all week." Grace almost laughed at that. As if humiliation became more reasonable once attached to stress. "He embarrassed my kid," she answered quietly. Darlene's expression shifted immediately. "Yeah." Silence lingered between them briefly before Darlene muttered, "That part wasn't right." Around noon the restaurant filled quickly with office workers escaping cold rain outside. Grace moved through tables automatically balancing plates, refilling coffee, smiling politely through exhaustion. Most customers never looked directly at servers long enough to recognize they were human outside the uniform. That invisibility usually protected her emotionally. Today it felt heavier somehow. Every time Daniel crossed the dining room speaking sharply into his phone or criticizing kitchen delays near the register, Grace felt her body tense instinctively. Around 1:30 she carried soup toward booth 12 when a familiar voice stopped her near the coffee station. "You're here again." Grace turned slightly. The man from last night stood beside the counter holding documents beneath one arm while waiting for takeout coffee. Up close he looked older than she first guessed. Mid-40s maybe. Tired eyes hidden beneath controlled posture. Expensive charcoal coat still damp from rain. Grace managed a polite smile. "I work here." A faint almost embarrassed expression crossed his face like he realized how obvious the statement sounded. "Right." Silence lingered awkwardly while nearby customers talked loudly over clinking dishes. Grace reached for cream packets automatically. "Black coffee?" she asked. He nodded once. "You remembered. You're easy." The sentence slipped out before she could stop it. Then immediately she corrected herself awkwardly. "I mean, your order is easy." Surprisingly, the man smiled slightly after that. Small smile. Brief. But real enough to soften something rigid in his face. "Daniel Whitmore," he said quietly while accepting the coffee. Grace nearly dropped the lid in her hand. Whitmore. The name registered instantly because it hung framed across the restaurant entrance beneath ownership documents and company awards. Daniel Whitmore. The owner. Not her boss from last night. His older brother. Grace suddenly understood the expensive car. The tailored coat. The detached calmness. "Grace Miller," she answered carefully while her stomach tightened unexpectedly. Daniel noticed the reaction immediately. "You know my brother." Grace glanced instinctively toward the kitchen where her manager shouted at line cooks through swinging doors. "Yeah." Daniel studied her expression for a second too long before lowering his voice. "About last night," Grace interrupted gently. "You don't need to apologize for him." "Maybe not." His eyes shifted briefly toward Ethan's drawing still taped beside the employee schedule board near the kitchen hallway. "But somebody should." Grace looked down quickly after hearing that because kindness always felt more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty was predictable. Kindness created hope accidentally. Daniel reached into his coat pocket then paused like reconsidering something. Finally he pulled out a business card instead. "If your car breaks down again," he said quietly, glancing toward the employee parking lot visible through rain-covered windows, "call this number." Grace frowned slightly. "You don't even know my car." Daniel's expression softened faintly. "The transmission whine is loud enough to hear from inside the restaurant." Grace felt heat rise embarrassingly into her face. She accepted the card slowly without promising anything. Before leaving, Daniel looked toward the kitchen again where his brother laughed loudly beside the register, completely unaware of the conversation happening 20 feet away. Some people mistake pressure for permission, Daniel said calmly. That doesn't make them right. Then he walked out into the rain carrying black coffee and documents while Grace remained frozen beside the counter longer than necessary. Hidden observer. Quiet witness. She did not fully understand why his words unsettled her so deeply. Maybe because after years of surviving alone, being seen at all felt emotionally dangerous. That evening things worsened again. Around 7 during dinner rush, Ethan's school called the restaurant because his asthma flared during aftercare. Grace answered beside the freezer hallway while kitchen noise echoed around her. Is he okay? She asked immediately. The nurse reassured her it was mild but suggested picking him up early because the inhaler at school ran empty. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Of course it did. Prescription refills cost $93 now after insurance changes. I'll come, she whispered. But when she approached Daniel's brother asking to leave 30 minutes early, his patience snapped again. You already missed 2 shifts this month. Grace kept her voice calm despite panic rising inside her chest. My son can't breathe properly. And the restaurant can't run short-staffed every time your personal life falls apart. Nearby customers turned subtly quiet again. Grace noticed immediately. Public humiliation always arrived in waves. I'm asking for 30 minutes, she said softly. I'm telling you no. His voice sharpened enough to cut through surrounding conversations. You need to decide whether you're serious about keeping this job. Grace stood completely still for a moment while shame and anger collided painfully inside her chest. Then without raising her voice once, she untied the apron slowly from around her waist and folded it carefully onto the counter between them. The restaurant became silent. Even Daniel's brother looked briefly caught off guard. Grace's hands trembled slightly but her expression remained calm. I already decided, she whispered. Then she walked out into the rain without waiting for permission while customers watched quietly from booths pretending not to stare. Outside, cold November wind hit her face immediately beneath dark city lights reflecting across wet streets. Grace crossed the parking lot quickly toward her shaking car while tears blurred traffic lights into soft orange smears. But before reaching the driver's door, she suddenly noticed someone standing beneath the restaurant awning across the lot. Daniel Whitmore. Watching silently through the rain. Grace drove through the rain with one hand gripping the steering wheel and the other pressed tightly against her chest like she could physically hold herself together long enough to reach Ethan. The windshield wipers dragged slowly across the glass because the motor had started failing months ago, leaving streaks of blurred headlights and neon reflections smearing across Toledo streets beneath cold November darkness. Her car rattled violently every time she stopped at intersections, and somewhere under the hood something metallic clicked in uneven rhythm. But none of it mattered compared to the sound replaying inside her head. You need to decide whether you're serious about keeping this job. Grace stared straight ahead while tears burned silently behind her eyes. Funny how people with stable salaries always talked about jobs like they were moral tests instead of survival. By the time she reached Lincoln Elementary, rain had softened into freezing drizzle coating sidewalks silver beneath parking lot lights. Ethan sat alone outside the nurse's office wrapped in his thin jacket while clutching the empty inhaler loosely between both hands. The moment he saw her, relief crossed his face so quickly it almost broke her completely. I'm okay, he whispered immediately, like children instinctively apologized whenever adults looked too worried. Grace knelt beside him and brushed damp hair gently away from his forehead. You don't have to be okay all the time. Ethan looked down quietly after that because children raised around struggle learned emotional restraint far too early. The drive home felt slower. Ethan eventually fell asleep against the passenger window while Grace stopped twice just to breathe through the panic pressing heavily inside her chest. No job now. $36 left in checking. Rent overdue already. Asthma medication needing refill by Friday. She kept calculating numbers automatically at red lights like survival itself had become mathematical. Back inside the apartment, the heat barely worked. Ethan curled beneath blankets on the couch while Grace sat alone at the kitchen table staring at unpaid bills beneath weak yellow light. Rain tapped softly against the windows again while somewhere downstairs the pawn shop owner argued loudly with somebody through thin walls. Grace rubbed both hands over her face slowly. Exhaustion no longer felt temporary. It felt architectural. Built into every corner of her life. Around midnight she opened the refrigerator and stood silently in front of nearly empty shelves. Half-gallon of milk. Eggs. Cheap lunch meat. One leftover container of soup. Grace closed the door carefully before Ethan could wake and notice her crying again. The next morning arrived cold and gray. Grace spent hours applying online for jobs while Ethan completed homework beside the couch coloring superheroes in silence. Most applications disappeared into automated systems without response. Restaurant experience. No college degree. Limited availability because of childcare. Every form felt less like opportunity and more like quiet elimination. Around noon her phone buzzed unexpectedly. Unknown number. Grace almost ignored it before answering softly. Grace Miller, a calm male voice asked. She recognized it immediately. Daniel Whitmore. Grace straightened instinctively at the kitchen table. Yes. Silence lingered briefly between them. I heard what happened last night. Grace laughed once under her breath. Pretty sure the whole restaurant did. Another pause. My brother shouldn't have spoken to you that way. Grace stared toward rainwater sliding slowly down the apartment window. Doesn't really matter now. Daniel's voice remained controlled, measured carefully like someone unused to emotional conversations. I'd like to meet with you. Grace frowned slightly. Why? Because I think you deserve an apology. She almost said no immediately. Pride flared fast whenever wealthy people suddenly discovered morality after witnessing public humiliation. But then Ethan coughed softly from the couch while searching for crayons beneath cushions, and reality interrupted emotion again. I don't have a babysitter, she answered quietly. Bring him. They met later that afternoon inside a quiet downtown cafe overlooking the river where businessmen usually held meetings over expensive coffee nobody truly tasted. Grace felt painfully out of place the moment she entered wearing her worn gray coat while Ethan clutched her hand tightly beside polished wooden tables and floor-to-ceiling windows. Daniel Whitmore already sat near the back corner beneath soft amber lighting, reading documents beside untouched black coffee. He stood immediately when they approached. Up close he looked even more emotionally restrained than before. Tailored charcoal coat. Expensive watch. Calm posture practiced through years of authority. But his eyes carried fatigue that reminded Grace unexpectedly of people working double shifts. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. Grace sat carefully across from him while Ethan remained close beside her shoulder. I almost didn't. Daniel nodded slightly like he respected the honesty. A waitress approached immediately offering menus, but Grace declined after seeing prices. Daniel noticed. Order whatever you want. We're fine. Ethan looked longingly toward hot chocolate pictures near the menu corner before lowering his eyes quickly. Daniel pretended not to notice and ordered one anyway for the table. Small kindnesses again. Dangerous things. My brother told me you quit, Daniel said once the waitress left. Grace folded both hands tightly together. I left. There's a difference. There is when somebody still has dignity. Daniel became very still after hearing that. Outside the cafe windows, river water moved dark beneath winter clouds while people hurried along sidewalks carrying umbrellas against the cold. You're right, he said eventually. Grace looked surprised by the answer. Most powerful people defended themselves automatically. Daniel studied Ethan quietly for a moment before speaking again. How long have you worked there? 3 years. And before that? Hospital cafeteria. Why restaurants? Grace almost laughed softly. Because they hire tired women quickly. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the coffee cup in his hands. Something about that response unsettled him visibly. Ethan remained quiet throughout most of the conversation until the waitress returned carrying hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. For the gentleman, she smiled warmly. Ethan looked immediately toward Grace before touching the mug. Permission first. Always permission first. Grace nodded gently. Go ahead. Daniel watched the interaction silently. Not judgmentally. More like somebody witnessing something emotionally unfamiliar. After a while he reached into his briefcase and removed a folded envelope. Grace stiffened immediately. I'm not taking charity. It's not charity. He slid the envelope carefully across the table anyway. Severance. Grace frowned. I wasn't fired. No, Daniel's voice stayed calm. But my family humiliated you publicly. Grace stared at the envelope without touching it. Why do you care so much? The question landed harder than she intended. Daniel leaned back slightly afterward while cafe noise moved softly around them. For several seconds he said nothing. Then finally he answered honestly. Because my mother raised my brother and me alone after our father died. Grace looked up slowly. Daniel's expression remained controlled, but something painful moved briefly behind it before disappearing again. She worked 2 jobs most of my childhood, he continued quietly. People talked to her the way my brother talked to you. Silence settled gently over the table after that. Ethan stirred whipped cream slowly without interrupting. Did somebody help her? Grace asked softly. Daniel looked out the cafe windows toward the gray river. Not enough. The answer changed something subtle between them. Not trust exactly. But recognition. Shared understanding hidden beneath completely different lives. Before leaving, Daniel handed Ethan a small paper bag from the cafe counter. For later. Ethan peeked inside during the drive home. 2 sandwiches. Fruit cups. Chocolate chip cookies wrapped carefully in paper. Grace gripped the steering wheel tighter while emotion rose unexpectedly through her chest again. Mom. Ethan whispered softly from the passenger seat. Yeah. That man looked sad. Grace glanced briefly toward him before returning her eyes to the wet road ahead. Strange observation for an 8-year-old. Yet somehow accurate. Maybe he is, she answered quietly. That night after Ethan fell asleep, Grace opened the envelope finally while sitting alone at the kitchen table beneath weak apartment light. Inside rested not only severance money but a handwritten note folded carefully beneath the check. You should never have been forced to choose between your child and your dignity. Grace stared at the sentence silently for a long time while rain moved softly against the windows outside. Hidden observer. Quiet witness. For reasons she did not fully understand yet, Daniel Whitmore had not forgotten her humiliation after everyone else moved on from it. And somewhere deep beneath her exhaustion, a dangerous feeling slowly began returning for the first time in years. Not hope exactly. But the possibility of being seen. Grace did not cash the severance check for 3 days. It stayed hidden inside a kitchen drawer beneath utility bills and Ethan's school forms while life continued pressing forward with quiet cruelty anyway. Every morning she still woke before sunrise because survival had trained her body to fear falling behind even after losing the restaurant job. She packed Ethan's lunches carefully from whatever remained in the refrigerator, walked him downstairs through the apartment hallway smelling faintly of cigarettes and radiator heat, then spent hours searching online for work while rain drifted endlessly across Toledo outside the windows. Most places never called back. Others offered shifts impossible for a single mother without childcare. Grocery stores wanted open availability. Hotels paid barely enough to survive. One manager glanced at the gap in her resume and asked whether family distractions would become an issue there too. Grace smiled politely through the humiliation because poor people learned quickly that anger frightened employers more than exhaustion ever did. Around the second week after leaving Miller's Grill, Ethan's asthma worsened again from the cold damp air inside the apartment building. Grace sat awake beside him one night listening carefully to his breathing while headlights drifted softly across the ceiling through rain-covered blinds. Every small cough tightened something inside her chest immediately. Around 3 in the morning she finally carried him half asleep into the bathroom and ran hot water in the shower just to fill the room with steam because the prescription refill still cost $93 she did not have yet. Ethan leaned quietly against her shoulder wrapped in blankets while condensation covered the mirror. "I'm sorry," he whispered weakly. Grace kissed the top of his head instantly. "You never apologize for being sick." But after he finally fell asleep again near dawn, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the severance check beneath weak yellow light while tears slid silently down her face. Dignity mattered. Pride mattered. But Ethan breathing mattered more. The next afternoon she walked into the bank downtown carrying the check folded carefully inside her coat pocket. Outside, freezing rain coated sidewalks silver while buses hissed through intersections, carrying exhausted workers home beneath gray skies. Grace waited in line surrounded by people discussing mortgages, office meetings, holiday travel plans. Entire worlds existing financially above survival mode. When the teller finally processed the deposit, Grace felt relief and shame arrive together in equal measure. That night she bought Ethan's medication refill, winter gloves, groceries, and a thicker blanket for the apartment couch where he slept. The total nearly made her dizzy anyway. Money disappeared frighteningly fast once people spent their lives calculating around its absence. A week later, Daniel Whitmore called again unexpectedly. Grace almost ignored the number before answering quietly beside the laundromat downstairs where she folded clothes while Ethan finished homework nearby. "How's your son?" he asked immediately. Grace hesitated slightly. "Better." "Good." Silence followed. Daniel always spoke like someone carefully measuring every sentence before releasing it into the world. "I wanted to ask you something." Grace waited beside the folding table while dryers hummed softly around them. "There's an administrative position opening at one of our corporate offices." She frowned instantly. "I don't work in offices." "Neither did my mother before she had to." Grace looked down at the warm towels in her hands. "Why are you doing this?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Because people deserve second chances after bad moments." Grace almost laughed softly at the phrasing. "That wasn't a bad moment." Her voice stayed calm but firm. "That was my life." Daniel did not defend himself. Somehow that made the conversation harder. "Come interview anyway," he said quietly. "If you hate it, walk away." Grace stared across the laundromat where Ethan sat drawing superheroes with crayons beside vending machines flickering beneath fluorescent lights. "I don't own office clothes." "Then wear whatever helped you survive this long." The line disconnected shortly afterward before Grace could answer. 2 mornings later she stood inside Whitmore Hospitality headquarters feeling painfully underdressed beneath polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Toledo. Her gray coat still carried faint detergent smell from the laundromat. The receptionist wore tailored black clothing and spoke in perfectly controlled corporate softness that made Grace hyper-aware of every scuff mark on her boots. Ethan sat beside her in the waiting area because school had closed during the ice storm overnight. He wore the new gloves bought with Daniel's severance check while sketching quietly in a notebook. "Mom," he whispered eventually while staring toward giant city windows. "This place feels expensive." Grace smiled faintly despite herself. "That's because it is." She expected Daniel to stay distant professionally once she arrived. Instead he came downstairs personally from the executive floor wearing the same restrained charcoal suits he always seemed to exist inside. But something about seeing him here changed the emotional atmosphere completely. At the restaurant he looked like a customer. Here he looked powerful. Employees straightened instinctively when he passed through the lobby. Conversations lowered slightly. Even the receptionist's posture changed once he approached. Grace. His voice remained calm but warmer than before. Then his eyes shifted toward Ethan. You drew that? Ethan looked down shyly at the superhero sketchbook in his lap. Daniel crouched slightly beside him instead of towering over the child like most wealthy adults did unintentionally. That's good work. Ethan blinked, surprised by the attention. Grace watched silently while something unfamiliar moved quietly through her chest again. Daniel led them upstairs afterward through quiet hallways lined with framed city photographs and soft amber lighting. The office interview itself felt strangely informal. No intimidating panel. No trick questions. Just Daniel sitting across from Grace inside a conference room overlooking frozen streets below while snow drifted softly against the windows outside. Tell me about yourself, he asked finally. Grace almost smiled tiredly. That question always feels dangerous. Daniel leaned back slightly. Why? Because people usually decide whether your struggle sounds respectable enough. He studied her carefully after that answer. Then tell me whatever version feels true. Grace looked out toward the snowy city while gathering herself emotionally. I got pregnant at 25. Her voice stayed steady. My husband left after Ethan was diagnosed with asthma because medical bills scared him more than fatherhood apparently. Daniel remained completely still, listening. Since then I've mostly worked wherever somebody needed tired women willing to stay late. The sentence hung quietly between them afterward. No self-pity. Just reality spoken plainly. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly toward his hands before asking softly, and what do you want? Grace frowned slightly because nobody asked that question anymore. Survival erased wanting eventually. Stability, she answered after a while. Enough money to stop calculating groceries before buying fruit. Snow continued drifting softly beyond the windows while silence settled comfortably for the first time since they met. Then Daniel asked something unexpected. Why didn't you scream at my brother? Grace looked genuinely confused. What? That night in the restaurant. His voice remained quiet. Most people would've. Grace stared down at the table for several seconds before answering honestly. Because Ethan was watching. The words hit Daniel visibly harder than anything else she said during the interview. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly before he looked away toward the window. Hidden observer again. Quiet witness. But now Grace understood something slowly too. Daniel Whitmore was not simply helping her because he felt guilty about public humiliation. Something deeper existed beneath his attention. Something personal. Before leaving, Grace stopped near the elevator while Ethan pulled his coat back on beside her. I should probably tell you something, she said carefully. Daniel looked up. I don't want pity employment. Good. His expression stayed restrained. I don't offer it. The elevator doors opened softly behind her. Then why me? Grace asked finally. Daniel hesitated longer this time than before. Long enough for truth to briefly reach his face. Because when my mother got humiliated publicly, he said. Quietly, nobody stepped in afterward. Grace felt the sentence settle somewhere deep inside her chest before the elevator doors closed gently between them. Later that night, while Ethan slept beside the apartment radiator under his new blanket, Grace sat alone by the window watching snow fall across Toledo streets glowing orange beneath traffic lights. The city looked quieter during storms. Softer somehow. She thought about Daniel's face after mentioning his mother. About the loneliness hidden carefully beneath his composure. About the way powerful people sometimes carried childhood wounds beneath tailored suits like invisible bruises nobody noticed anymore. Then she looked toward Ethan sleeping peacefully for the first time in days and realized something dangerous had already begun happening between her and Daniel Whitmore. Not romance. Not trust. Recognition. Grace got the job 2 weeks later during the first heavy snowfall of December. Toledo disappeared beneath thick gray skies while buses crawled slowly through slush-covered intersections and people hurried into office buildings clutching coffee cups against the cold. Ethan stood beside the apartment window watching snow collect along parked cars when Grace received the phone call from Whitmore Hospitality. She listened quietly from the kitchen while the HR representative explained onboarding paperwork, training schedules, and salary details in polished corporate language that almost did not sound real. Stable income. Health insurance after 90 days. Predictable hours. Grace pressed one trembling hand against the counter while staring toward unpaid bills still scattered beneath the weak yellow kitchen light. "Mom," Ethan whispered after she hung up. Grace looked at him slowly. "We're okay for a while." Ethan smiled immediately. Small smile. Careful smile. The kind children develop after spending too long around financial fear. That night Grace bought Chinese takeout for the first time in months and let Ethan choose soda instead of tap water. They ate cross-legged on the apartment floor beside the radiator while snow drifted outside beneath orange streetlights. Ethan kept grinning every few minutes. Like he expected the good news to disappear if nobody kept checking it existed. Grace watched him quietly while emotion moved softly through her chest. She forgot how survival changed children. How quickly they learned to measure safety through groceries, heat, and the sound of adults arguing less often about money. Her first weeks at Whitmore Hospitality felt emotionally disorienting. Everything operated quietly there. Carpet absorbed footsteps. Elevators smelled faintly like cedar and expensive perfume. Employees lowered their voices automatically around executives instead of shouting across kitchens or balancing trays through crowded aisles. Grace worked inside corporate administration processing scheduling documents and guest service reports for several downtown properties. The tasks themselves were simple enough, but the emotional adjustment exhausted her more than the workload. For years she survived environments where urgency never stopped. Restaurants. Cafeterias. Endless noise. Endless movement. Here silence itself felt expensive. Most co-workers treated her politely but distantly. Some recognized her immediately from the restaurant incident because staff gossip traveled faster through wealthy circles than people admitted publicly. Grace caught certain glances lingering slightly too long during meetings. Curiosity disguised as professionalism. The single mom from the public scene. Daniel Whitmore's quiet project. She ignored it because survival had already taught her how invisibility functioned socially. Around mid-January, Grace stayed late organizing conference materials while most employees left early ahead of another winter storm. The executive floor remained nearly empty except for muted cleaning crews vacuuming distant hallways beneath soft amber lighting. Grace rubbed tired eyes while sorting paperwork near the copy room when she noticed Daniel standing alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Toledo. Snow moved heavily across the city outside while office reflections blurred softly against the glass. He looked strangely motionless there. Almost lonely. Grace hesitated before approaching. "You're still here?" she asked. Quietly. Daniel turned slightly. "So are you." Grace smiled faintly. Paperwork doesn't care about weather. Something softened briefly in his expression after hearing that. They stood beside the windows together for a moment watching snow bury traffic below. "You've adjusted quickly," Daniel said eventually. Grace folded both arms loosely against the cold glass nearby. "I'm good at adapting." "That's not always the same thing." The sentence lingered quietly between them afterward. Grace studied his reflection in the darkened window. Even after weeks working here, Daniel still carried emotional distance carefully around himself like another tailored layer beneath the expensive suits. Employees respected him. Some feared him slightly. But nobody seemed close to him. "Do you ever go home?" she asked softly before thinking too much about it. Daniel almost smiled again. "Eventually." "That bad?" "Depends who you ask." Grace looked back toward the snowfall outside. "Usually people who stay late at work are avoiding something." Daniel became very still after that observation. Hidden observer again. This time her turn. "You always notice more than people expect," he said quietly. Grace shrugged lightly. "Working restaurants teaches you everything about people." Silence settled comfortably for several seconds before Daniel finally spoke again. "My mother used to clean office buildings overnight downtown." Grace looked up slowly. "You mentioned her before." Daniel nodded once while staring out toward the storm-covered city. "She worked 3 jobs after my father died." His voice stayed controlled, but grief still lived somewhere beneath it. "People treated her like exhaustion was some kind of moral failure." Grace lowered her eyes quietly because the sentence felt painfully familiar. "When my brother humiliated you," Daniel continued softly, "it felt like watching somebody talk to her all over again." Grace swallowed hard after hearing that. Suddenly the severance check, the interview, the careful attention, all of it rearranged emotionally into something clearer. Not charity. Recognition. Daniel saw his mother standing inside her humiliation. "Did she ever get out?" Grace asked gently. Snow drifted harder outside while office lights reflected softly across the windows. Daniel waited several seconds before answering. "No," one word. Heavy enough to explain entire lifetimes. The next few months passed slowly beneath winter storms and long office hours. Grace adjusted to stability cautiously, like someone afraid life might punish her for relaxing too much. She bought Ethan proper winter boots. Paid overdue electricity bills before shutoff notices arrived. Started grocery shopping without calculating every dollar first. Small things. Ordinary things. But to Grace they felt almost unreal. Yet despite financial relief, emotional exhaustion lingered stubbornly beneath everything. Trauma did not disappear simply because circumstances improved. Some nights she still woke abruptly at 3 a.m. terrified she forgot to clock into a shift somewhere. Other times she stood frozen inside grocery aisles unable to believe she could afford fresh fruit without panic. Daniel noticed more than she realized. He never asked invasive questions or offered pity disguised as kindness. Instead he paid attention quietly. One snowy evening after a long staff meeting, Grace found a new inhaler resting anonymously beside her office keyboard with no note attached. Another morning the maintenance department somehow repaired the broken heater inside her apartment building within 24 hours after months of landlord excuses. Grace understood immediately who likely made those calls. She never mentioned it directly because some kindnesses felt more respectful left unspoken. Hidden observer psychology moved silently between them now. Around March, Whitmore Hospitality hosted a large downtown charity gala benefiting single-parent housing initiatives. Corporate executives, donors, media representatives, entire worlds. Grace previously only served food to from distance. She spent most of the evening helping coordinate guest lists and event logistics while wearing a simple dark blue dress borrowed from Darlene at the restaurant. Grace still felt uncomfortable around wealth displayed casually. Crystal chandeliers. $100 wine bottles. Conversations about vacation homes and investment portfolios happening beside silent waiters carrying silver trays through ballroom crowds. At one point during the event she stepped outside onto the hotel terrace just to breathe cold air away from all the polished noise. Snow melted softly across rooftop railings while city lights shimmered below. Overwhelming? Daniel's voice asked gently behind her. Grace turned slightly. He stood there in a tailored black suit beneath soft terrace lighting, hands tucked loosely into coat pockets against the cold. A little. Daniel moved beside her overlooking downtown streets glowing beneath March rain. You get used to it eventually. Grace shook her head faintly. I'm not sure I want to. Surprisingly, Daniel laughed softly under his breath. Real laugh this time. Brief but genuine enough to warm something in the cold night air between them. Then his expression quieted again. That's probably healthy. They stood silently afterward, listening to distant traffic and ballroom music muffled through hotel walls behind them. Then Grace noticed movement through the glass doors leading back inside. Daniel's brother stood near the bar laughing with investors across the room, completely unaware she watched him. Her body tightened instinctively before she could stop it. Daniel noticed immediately. He doesn't know you work here yet, he said quietly. Grace kept staring through the glass. Does it matter? Daniel's jaw shifted subtly. To me, yes. The answer unsettled her unexpectedly. Not because of romance. Because of loyalty. Nobody defended Grace publicly before without expecting something emotionally transactional afterward. Daniel simply stood beside her in silence while rain moved across downtown Toledo below. Then quietly, almost carefully, he said, "You didn't deserve what happened that night." Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest again. The dangerous kind. The kind built from finally being understood. She looked toward him slowly beneath the rooftop lights. Neither did your mother. Daniel lowered his eyes after that while silence settled gently around them. And somewhere deep beneath the cold March sky, two people carrying different versions of the same childhood loneliness finally recognized each other completely. By April, Grace no longer checked her bank balance before buying groceries. The realization frightened her more than she expected. Stability felt unnatural after enough years surviving emergency to emergency. Some mornings she still woke before dawn, convinced she overslept a restaurant shift that no longer existed. Other nights she stood frozen in supermarket aisles staring at strawberries or orange juice too long because part of her body still believed small luxuries belonged to other families. Trauma did not disappear once circumstances improved. It simply stopped screaming loudly enough for other people to notice. Toledo softened slowly into spring beneath endless rain and pale skies while Grace adjusted carefully to life inside Whitmore hospitality. The office rhythms became more familiar now. Morning meetings. Quiet elevators. Polished hallways smelling faintly of coffee and expensive cologne. She learned how executives spoke differently when discussing struggling employees versus struggling investors. One group became budget concerns. The other became human resource complications. Grace listened carefully to everything because restaurants had trained her to survive through observation long before corporate offices ever noticed her existence. Daniel noticed her observations too. During meetings he sometimes glanced toward Grace after someone made a careless comment about hourly workers or staffing costs, like he silently wondered whether she heard the cruelty hidden beneath professional language the same way he suddenly did now. She always did. One rainy Thursday evening after most employees left for the day, Grace stayed late finishing reports while thunder rolled softly across downtown Toledo outside the office windows. Ethan sat beside her desk coloring quietly because after-school care closed early during the storm. Around 7, the lights dimmed automatically throughout half the floor as cleaning crews started night rotations. Grace rubbed tired eyes and stretched slightly before noticing Ethan staring toward the executive hallway. "Mom," he whispered. "That man's here again." Daniel stood near the break room doorway holding 2 paper bags from the cafe downstairs while rainwater darkened the shoulders of his charcoal coat. "You both still working?" he asked gently. Ethan smiled immediately at the sight of food. Grace noticed Daniel pretending not to see that reaction directly. "Deadlines," she answered quietly. Daniel handed Ethan one of the bags. "Turkey sandwich. No tomatoes this time." Ethan blinked surprised. "You remembered?" Daniel's expression softened almost invisibly. "You complained about them for 10 minutes last week." Ethan laughed softly while opening the bag. Grace watched the interaction silently. Daniel behaved around children differently than adults expected wealthy men to behave. No performance. No exaggerated charm. Just quiet attention. Like someone who understood loneliness early enough to recognize it instinctively in other people. They ate together inside the break room afterward while rain pressed heavily against the windows and city lights shimmered across wet streets below. Grace sat across from Daniel beneath soft fluorescent lighting while Ethan worked on homework nearby. You know, Grace said eventually, most executives don't eat vending machine chips for dinner. Daniel looked down at the crumpled bag beside him. Most executives also go home before midnight. You still avoid answering questions directly. A faint smile touched his face. Occupational hazard. Silence settled comfortably for a moment before Grace asked softly, "Why do you stay so late?" Daniel stared toward the rain outside the break room windows. Because empty apartments feel louder than offices. The honesty surprised both of them slightly. Grace lowered her eyes toward the coffee cup warming her hands. That sounds lonely. Daniel leaned back quietly in the chair. It usually is. Ethan suddenly looked up from his homework then. Mom says lonely people always notice each other faster. Grace flushed immediately. Ethan. But Daniel looked strangely thoughtful after hearing it. Your mom says smart things. Ethan shrugged casually. She says them when she thinks I'm asleep. Grace laughed softly despite herself while thunder moved across the city outside. Small moments like this unsettled her emotionally because they felt dangerously close to peace. Weeks passed quietly after that. Grace settled deeper into office life while Daniel's presence slowly became part of her daily rhythm without either of them acknowledging it directly. Morning coffee appearing beside her desk after difficult meetings. Ethan's asthma specialist suddenly recommending a better clinic somehow covered through expanded insurance approval. Maintenance crews repairing the broken stairwell lights inside her apartment building after months of tenant complaints. Daniel never announced these things. Never positioned himself as heroic. He simply noticed problems and quietly moved them aside where possible. Hidden observer psychology again. But now Grace understood something important. Daniel helped people the way emotionally wounded children often learn to love. Quietly. Indirectly. Through protection instead of vulnerability. Then one afternoon in early May, everything shifted again. Grace stepped out of an elevator carrying conference materials when she heard familiar laughter near the executive conference room. Daniel's brother stood beside several regional managers discussing quarterly numbers beneath soft office lighting. Grace froze instinctively before he noticed her. The silence arrived immediately afterward. His expression changed from confusion to recognition in less than 2 seconds. Grace. The way he said her name carried visible disbelief. Grace kept her posture calm despite feeling old humiliation rise sharply through her chest again. Hello, Mark. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances while rain tapped softly against the office windows nearby. Mark looked from Grace to the conference materials in her hands. You work here? Before she could answer, Daniel's voice arrived quietly from behind them. She does. The atmosphere changed instantly. Daniel stepped beside Grace with controlled calmness while tension moved silently through the hallway. Mark stared at his brother in open confusion. You hired her? Daniel's expression never shifted. I did, after what happened at the restaurant. Grace felt heat rise painfully into her chest again. Not because of shame this time. Because everyone in the hallway suddenly remembered the humiliation simultaneously. Mark laughed once awkwardly beneath the pressure. Daniel, come on. You know how stressful things were back then. Grace looked down immediately because powerful people always reached for stress when trying to explain cruelty afterward. But Daniel stayed perfectly still beside her. Stress explains mistakes, he said quietly. Not character. Silence swallowed the hallway after that. Even the rain outside seemed softer suddenly. Mark's expression tightened defensively. You're really doing this here? Daniel finally looked directly at his brother. You humiliated a single mother in front of her child publicly. His voice never rose. Somehow that made it heavier. I'm simply acknowledging it happened. Grace stood motionless beside the conference room while emotion moved painfully through her chest. Nobody had ever defended her publicly before without turning it into performance or pity. Daniel simply told the truth calmly in front of witnesses and refused to soften it for comfort. Mark glanced toward Grace finally. For the first time since the restaurant, embarrassment crossed his face instead of hers. Look, he muttered stiffly, I shouldn't have said those things. Grace studied him quietly. The apology sounded uncomfortable but genuine enough to matter. Yet strangely, she realized she no longer needed it the way she once thought she did. No, she answered softly. You shouldn't have. Then she walked past both brothers toward the conference room with steady hands while rain blurred the city outside into soft silver light. Later that evening after most employees left, Daniel found Grace standing alone near the rooftop terrace overlooking downtown Toledo beneath fading sunset clouds. Wind moved gently through her hair while traffic lights flickered below across wet streets. You okay? He asked quietly. Grace nodded once without turning immediately. I thought apologizing would feel bigger. Daniel stepped beside her overlooking the city. Sometimes healing's quieter than people expect. Grace wrapped both arms loosely against the cold breeze. When he apologized, she hesitated briefly. I realized the worst part of that night wasn't even him. Daniel waited silently. It was how quickly I believed him. The confession settled heavily between them. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the streetlights below. People carrying too much responsibility usually blame themselves first. Grace looked toward him carefully after hearing that. You talk like somebody who knows. Daniel smiled faintly but sadly. I do. Evening light softened slowly across the skyline while distant thunder moved somewhere beyond the river. Grace studied his face beside her beneath the rooftop shadows. The loneliness there no longer looked hidden now. Just controlled. Managed carefully through work, responsibility, and emotional distance. Did anybody ever defend your mother? She asked softly. Daniel stared toward the city for several seconds before answering. No, one word again. Quiet enough to carry years inside it. Grace felt something shift permanently then. Not romance. Not gratitude. Something deeper. Recognition becoming connection slowly and carefully between two people who understood what survival cost emotionally long after circumstances improved. Below them, Toledo glowed beneath spring rain and traffic while wind moved gently across the rooftop terrace. Neither spoke again for a long while. But for the first time in years, Grace no longer felt invisible standing beside someone. Summer arrived slowly over Toledo with humid rainstorms, glowing traffic lights, and the heavy stillness that settled over the city after long workdays. By June, Grace no longer felt like a temporary visitor inside Whitmore hospitality. People greeted her naturally in hallways now. Co-workers asked about Ethan by name. Her office desk carried small evidence of ordinary life returning piece by piece, framed school photos, coffee mugs left overnight, sticky notes reminding her about parent-teacher meetings instead of overdue bills. Stability had not erased the exhaustion inside her completely, but it softened the panic enough for breathing. Room finally to exist around it. Ethan changed too. He laughed easier now. Slept through the night more often. His teachers stopped sending concerned emails about withdrawn behavior during class. One Saturday morning Grace stood in the kitchen making pancakes while sunlight moved softly through the apartment windows, and suddenly realized Ethan had started singing quietly to himself again. The sound nearly broke her emotionally because she had forgotten children did that when they felt safe. Around that same time, Daniel's presence inside their lives became quieter but deeper. Not dramatic. Never forced. Some evenings he joined them for dinner at small diners away from downtown where nobody recognized executives in tailored coats sitting beside single mothers helping children color paper menus. Other times he simply called asking whether Ethan's asthma had improved after rainstorms. Grace noticed he never crossed emotional boundaries recklessly. He moved carefully around vulnerable people, like someone terrified of causing harm accidentally. One humid evening in late July, Grace and Ethan attended a community fundraiser hosted by Whitmore Hospitality at a renovated lakeside hotel near Lake Erie. Warm string lights reflected softly across the water while live jazz drifted through the summer air and families moved slowly between tables beneath the fading sunset. Ethan chased fireflies near the shoreline with several other children while Grace stood alone beside the railing watching waves move gently against the docks. "You look less tired lately." Daniel's voice arrived softly beside her. Grace smiled faintly without looking away from the water immediately. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." Daniel rested both hands lightly against the railing beside her. Even in relaxed settings he carried the same controlled stillness around himself. "It's true." Grace glanced toward him then. "You still look tired." A faint smile touched his face before disappearing again. "Occupational hazard." "No," Grace answered gently. "Loneliness." Daniel looked down after hearing that. The music behind them softened while warm wind moved across the lake carrying distant laughter and conversation through the darkening evening. "You noticed dangerous things," he said quietly. Grace leaned slightly against the railing. "I had to. Survival kind of trains people that way." Daniel remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "My mother used to sit awake at night balancing bills at the kitchen table." Grace's chest tightened immediately because she knew that image intimately. "Sometimes I'd pretend to be asleep and watch her through the hallway." His voice stayed calm, but grief still moved underneath it, carefully restrained. "She always looked most exhausted when she thought nobody could see her anymore." Grace stared out toward the dark water while emotion rose quietly inside her chest. "That's the hardest part about struggling," she whispered. "People only witness the public moments. They never see what survival costs privately." Daniel looked toward her then with an expression so emotionally open it startled her slightly. Recognition again. Deep and undeniable now. Before either of them could speak further, Ethan came running back breathless holding a tiny glass jar with 2 fireflies glowing softly inside. "Mom, look." Grace laughed quietly while kneeling beside him. Daniel watched them both silently beneath the warm lakeside lights, and for the first time in years something dangerous flickered through his expression too. Not attraction exactly. Longing. The emotional kind rooted in family rather than romance. 2 weeks later, everything shifted again unexpectedly. Grace arrived at work Monday morning to find tension moving quietly through the executive floor. Conversations lowered when she passed. Assistants exchanged uncomfortable glances near conference rooms. By noon she learned why. A local business journal had published an article criticizing Whitmore Hospitality for executive misconduct allegations involving several regional managers, including Daniel's brother Mark. Employee mistreatment. Unethical scheduling pressure. Public humiliation complaints from former staff members. The restaurant incident itself was not mentioned directly, but Grace immediately recognized the emotional shadow of it beneath. The article's language. Around 3 that afternoon, Daniel asked her to step into his office. Rain pressed heavily against the giant windows behind him while dark storm clouds swallowed most of the skyline outside. He looked more exhausted than she had ever seen him. Tie loosened slightly. Coffee untouched near scattered legal documents. "You okay?" Grace asked quietly after closing the door. Daniel rubbed tired fingers across his forehead. "Depends what your definition is." Grace sat carefully across from him while thunder rolled softly outside. "The article?" Daniel nodded once. "Board members are pressuring me to protect the company image." "Meaning?" Daniel looked directly at her then. Meaning they want me to distance the corporation from employee accusations before more stories surface. Grace understood immediately. Silence people quietly. Protect executives. Prioritize reputation over truth. Corporate survival works similarly everywhere eventually. And what do you want to do? She asked softly. Daniel leaned back slowly in the chair while rain moved across the windows behind him. My mother spent her entire life being treated like struggling people were disposable. His voice stayed controlled but emotionally heavy beneath it. I'm not building another company that survives by humiliating exhausted workers. Grace felt something shift powerfully inside her chest hearing him say that aloud. Moral integrity. Not performance. Not public relations. Actual conviction. Then Daniel said something unexpected. The board thinks helping you was emotional weakness. Grace blinked slightly. What? They think I got personally involved because I felt guilty. Grace looked down quietly after hearing that because part of her feared the same thing once too. Daniel studied her expression carefully. That's not why I hired you. Grace met his eyes again slowly. I know. Silence settled between them while stormlight darkened the office around them. Then Daniel asked softly, do you regret coming here? Grace thought about the apartment before this job. The cold nights listening to Ethan's struggle breathing. The humiliation inside the restaurant. The endless fear. No. She answered honestly. Do you? Daniel looked toward the rain-covered city for several long seconds before replying. Not even a little. Later that evening after most employees left, Grace found herself standing alone inside the empty conference room overlooking downtown Toledo. Rainwater blurred traffic lights below into soft red and gold reflections while cleaning crews moved silently through distant hallways. She thought about how strange life felt now. 14 months ago she stood humiliated beside shattered plates while strangers avoided eye contact. Now she sat inside executive offices discussing ethics and dignity with the only powerful person who ever truly saw her. Hidden observer psychology had transformed slowly into something much deeper than either of them expected. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. Daniel stepped into the room carrying 2 paper coffee cups. Thought you might still be here. Grace accepted the cup carefully. Thanks. He sat across from her beneath dim conference lighting while thunder softened farther away beyond the city. Can I ask you something? He said quietly. Grace nodded. Daniel looked down briefly at the coffee in his hands before speaking. That night at the restaurant, after my brother humiliated you, he hesitated. Why didn't you quit sooner? Grace stared toward the rain-covered windows for a long time before answering. Because when you're poor with a child depending on you, dignity becomes expensive. The sentence settled heavily between them. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately like the truth physically hurt to hear aloud. Grace studied him carefully across the table then. But eventually, she continued softly, there's a moment where surviving starts costing more than leaving. Silence filled the conference room afterward except for rain tapping gently against the glass. Then Daniel finally looked toward her again. I'm glad you left. Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. Not because of the words themselves. Because somebody finally understood what leaving actually cost her. Outside, Toledo glowed beneath the storm while 2 exhausted people sat quietly together inside a nearly empty building, no longer invisible to each other at all. 14 months after the night Grace Miller walked out of Miller's downtown grill beneath cold November rain, Toledo looked different somehow. Or maybe she did. Summer faded slowly into early autumn while leaves gathered along sidewalks outside Whitmore Hospitality and warm evening light settled softly across downtown windows at the end of long workdays. Life had not transformed into perfection. The apartment was still small. Ethan still carried inhalers in his backpack. Bills still existed. But survival no longer felt like drowning quietly every day. That alone changed the emotional atmosphere of everything around her. One Friday evening in late September, Grace left the office carrying leftover conference folders while sunset reflected gold across rain-damp streets below. Ethan waited downstairs near the lobby sketching superheroes in a notebook beside the security desk like he often did after school. The moment he saw her, he smiled immediately without hesitation or worry. Grace noticed that now. The absence of fear in him. Children stopped scanning adults for emotional danger once safety became consistent long enough. "You hungry?" she asked softly while helping him into his jacket. Ethan nodded. "Can we get pancakes?" Grace laughed quietly. "For dinner. That's when pancakes taste most important." She kissed the top of his head lightly before they stepped outside into cool evening air beneath glowing city lights. Across the street, Daniel stood near the curb speaking quietly with a driver beside a black sedan. He looked up the moment Grace and Ethan exited the building. Even from distance Grace recognized the exhaustion in his posture immediately. The company investigation from the summer had finally settled publicly 2 weeks earlier. Several managers resigned quietly. New worker protection policies were implemented across Whitmore properties. Nobody inside the company spoke dramatically about it afterward. No triumphant speeches. No polished public redemption. Just small structural changes built slowly and seriously. Daniel approached them after ending the conversation near the car. "You two heading home?" Ethan answered first. "Pancakes." Daniel smiled faintly. "That sounds more intelligent than most corporate dinners." Grace studied him carefully beneath the fading evening light. He looked tired in a deeper way lately. Not overwhelmed. Emptied. Like someone finally stopped carrying emotional weight alone and suddenly realized how heavy it truly was. "You should come," Ethan offered casually. Daniel blinked, slightly surprised by the invitation. Grace watched uncertainty flicker briefly across his expression before he looked toward her quietly. "Only if that's okay." Grace nodded once. "It's okay." They ended up inside a small 24-hour diner near the river where old country songs played softly through ceiling speakers and coffee smelled permanently burned into the walls. Rain drifted gently against the windows while truck drivers and exhausted nurses occupied scattered booths beneath fluorescent lights. Nobody there recognized Daniel Whitmore as a corporate executive. He looked strangely more comfortable because of that. Ethan talked almost non-stop through pancakes and chocolate milk while showing Daniel every drawing inside his notebook. Superheroes. Buildings. Cars. Small sketches of Grace sitting beside apartment windows during thunderstorms. Daniel studied each page carefully like the child's artwork carried genuine importance. Grace watched silently from across the booth while warmth moved quietly through her chest. Not romantic warmth. Something slower. More fragile. The feeling of witnessing two lonely people slowly stop being lonely around each other. At one point Ethan excused himself toward the restroom, leaving Grace and Daniel alone beneath the dim diner lights while rain blurred traffic outside. "He's happier now," Daniel said softly after a while. Grace looked down at the untouched coffee warming her hands. "Yeah." Silence settled gently between them before she added quietly, "I forgot kids are supposed to laugh that much." Daniel studied her carefully. "And you?" Grace almost smiled. "I'm learning." The waitress refilled their coffee cups while tired travelers moved through the diner entrance carrying wet jackets and overnight bags. Ordinary life continuing softly around them. "You know," Grace said eventually, "for a long time I thought survival meant enduring humiliation quietly." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly after hearing that. "A lot of people do. But I think," she paused searching for the right words. "I think survival's supposed to eventually lead somewhere softer than that." Daniel looked toward her slowly then. The expression on his face carried something emotionally unguarded for the first time since she met him. "My mother used to say almost the same thing." Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. Not grief this time. Recognition settling peacefully instead of painfully. Ethan returned moments later talking excitedly about dessert options while rain continued moving softly across the diner windows. Later that night Daniel drove them home because Grace's car finally stopped working completely the week before. The city looked quiet beneath autumn rain and glowing streetlights while jazz played softly through the speakers. Ethan fell asleep in the back seat halfway home clutching his notebook against his chest. Daniel parked carefully outside the apartment building but left the engine running while rain tapped gently against the windshield. Neither moved immediately. Grace stared out toward wet sidewalks shining beneath orange streetlights while silence settled comfortably around them. "You know what's strange?" she said quietly after a while. Daniel glanced toward her. "What?" Grace smiled faintly without looking at him yet. 14 months ago I thought my life ended in that restaurant." Rain moved softly across the glass between them and the dark city outside. Daniel waited silently. "But now," Grace continued gently, "I think maybe it was just the first moment somebody finally saw me clearly." Daniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly after hearing that. Emotion moved behind his eyes before settling again into quiet restraint. "You were always visible," he said softly. "People just weren't looking carefully enough." Grace finally turned toward him then. The car remained filled with soft dashboard light and rain reflections while Ethan slept peacefully. In the back seat behind them. No dramatic declarations. No cinematic kiss. Just two exhausted adults sitting quietly together after surviving different versions of the same loneliness. Grace reached toward the dashboard slowly and lowered the radio volume until only rain remained audible around them. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel shook his head faintly. "For what?" Grace looked toward Ethan sleeping in the back seat before answering. "For not treating dignity like it was optional." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately after that while emotion crossed his face too quickly for words. Outside, the rain softened into mist drifting beneath streetlights and apartment windows glowing warmly above quiet sidewalks. Grace carefully unbuckled Ethan and lifted him gently from the back seat while Daniel carried the child's backpack toward the building entrance beside her. Halfway up the stairs Ethan stirred sleepily against Grace's shoulder. "Mom," he mumbled softly. "Yeah, baby. You don't cry in the bathroom anymore." Grace stopped moving for just a second after hearing that. Daniel stood quietly one step below them in the dim stairwell while warm hallway light flickered overhead. Grace kissed Ethan's forehead gently. "No," she whispered. "Not anymore." Upstairs, after Ethan fell asleep beneath blankets beside the humming radiator, Grace stood alone near the apartment window overlooking rain-covered Toledo streets below. The city glowed softly beneath autumn fog while distant traffic moved through reflections of red and gold light. Down near the curb, Daniel still stood beside his car for a moment before getting inside. Not rushing. Just looking quietly toward the apartment windows above him. Hidden observer. But no longer hidden from her. Grace rested one hand lightly against the cool glass while watching the headlights disappear slowly into the wet city night. Then the apartment became still again except for rain against the windows and Ethan breathing softly from the next room. Grace looked around the small apartment carefully after that. The repaired heater humming steadily. School drawings taped beside the refrigerator. Pancake syrup still sticky on Ethan's sleeve. Hanging over a kitchen chair. Ordinary things. Safe things. For years she believed dignity meant surviving pain silently because nobody was coming to help. But standing there beneath soft yellow kitchen light while rain drifted quietly across Toledo outside, Grace finally understood something different. Sometimes healing arrived slowly through people who simply refused to look away from your suffering once they saw it clearly. No applause. No dramatic rescue. Just recognition. And in the silence of that small apartment, after 14 long months of rebuilding herself piece by piece, Grace Miller no longer felt invisible at all.